For 15 years, Calder Hayes has lived with the memory of being abandoned. He was one of the boys left stranded in a state park when their trusted geology teacher, Mr. Albright, disappeared with the school bus and was never seen again. While the world branded Albright a coward or a criminal, Calder, now a local journalist, could never shake the feeling that something more sinister happened that day. A call from the sheriff's department about an impossible discovery changes everything. A single bus seat, unearthed by a construction crew in a remote quarry, suggests the teacher's panicked flight ended in a violent confrontation. What follows is a story of a cold case, a determined survivor, and a secret that lay buried for over a decade. As you listen, think about how a single event can shape a person's entire life, and how far you might go to uncover a truth that everyone else has forgotten. The date May 18th was etched into Calder Hayes' mind like a scar. Every year it arrived with the faint scent of pine needles and the hollow feeling of being left behind. Now 31, Calder sat at his cluttered desk at the Oak Ridge Chronicle, the screen in front of him blank. He should have been writing an article about a zoning dispute, but his thoughts were 15 years in the past. Tucked into the frame of his monitor was a faded photograph from 2006, a group of lanky, smiling teenage boys in front of a yellow school bus. Calder was in the front, grinning, oblivious. Standing beside them was Mr. Albright, their geology teacher, a man with a kind face and a passion for rocks that was surprisingly contagious. That was the last picture ever taken of him. Hours later, the boys would be found alone and confused at the trailhead, and Mr. Albright and the bus would be gone. The mystery of that day had defined Calder's life. It was why he became a journalist. While other reporters chased breaking news, Calder was drawn to the quiet, forgotten stories, the cold cases, the lingering questions. He'd always felt that the official narrative was too simple. Mr. Albright, a dedicated teacher with no family issues or financial trouble, abandoning a bus full of students in the middle of a state park. It never sat right. The authorities concluded he'd had some kind of breakdown, a secret life that made him run. The bus was found 2 weeks later, wiped clean and abandoned in a parking lot 3 states away. But Mr. Albright himself had vanished from the face of the earth. The sharp ring of his desk phone snapped Calder back to the present. It was a number he recognized instantly, the direct line for the county sheriff. "Hayes," he answered, his voice flat. "Calder, it's Sheriff Brody." The voice was gravelly, weathered by time. Brody had been a young deputy on the case back in 2006, one of the few who had seemed to listen to the scared, confused teenagers. "Sheriff, don't tell me the town council is complaining about my article on the budget again." "Not today," Brody said, his tone serious. "Something's happened. A crew is clearing the old red granite quarry for that new housing development out on Route 9. This morning, a backhoe operator hit something." Calder sat up straighter. The red granite quarry had been defunct for decades, a closed-off, forgotten piece of land. Brody continued, "It was a bus seat, Calder. A single blue vinyl school bus seat. Looks like it was ripped right off its moorings." The air in Calder's lungs felt thin. He gripped the phone, his knuckles turning white. "Are you sure it's from—" "We can't be 100% yet, but it matches the make and model from the bus that went missing. It was buried about 6 feet down. Doesn't look like it got there by accident." A 15-year-old wound ripped open. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a summons from his own past. "I'm on my way," Calder said, already grabbing his jacket and keys. For the first time in a long time, the anniversary of May 18th wasn't about remembering what was lost. It was about finding what was hidden. The drive to the quarry was a blur of familiar roads that felt suddenly alien. The red granite quarry was a place kids were warned to stay away from, a sprawling, rocky pit surrounded by a chain-link fence that had more holes than wire. As Calder pulled up, he saw the official vehicles and the yellow tape. The construction equipment stood silent, massive and imposing. Sheriff Brody met him at the tape line. He was older now, with more gray in his hair, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Figured you'd want to see this for yourself," Brody said, lifting the tape. He led Calder to the edge of an excavated pit. There, sitting on a dusty tarp, was the seat. It was mangled, the blue vinyl torn in a jagged line across the backrest, exposing the yellowed foam beneath. The metal legs were bent and twisted, clearly torn from the bus floor with immense force. It was buried over there, Brody said, pointing to a freshly dug hole. The operator thought he hit a boulder. Lucky he didn't tear it to shreds. Calder knelt, his journalistic detachment gone. He was a 16-year-old boy again, remembering the familiar feel of that vinyl on a sunny morning. It looks like it was torn out in a struggle, Calder murmured, tracing the rip with his eyes. That's what I was thinking, Brody agreed. We're sending it to the state lab. See if forensics can pull anything from it after all this time. The soil here is dense clay. It can preserve things better than you'd think. Look at this. The sheriff pointed to a dark, rust-colored stain on the fabric, barely visible against the dark blue. Could be anything. Oil, rust, or something else. Something else. The unspoken word hung in the air between them. Blood. This changes everything, Calder said, standing up. He didn't just run. Something happened to him. Something happened on that bus. Maybe, Brody said cautiously, or maybe he did this himself to throw people off. We can't jump to conclusions. But Calder knew. That feeling, that deep, nagging doubt he'd carried for 15 years was finally solidifying into something real. Mr. Albright hadn't abandoned them. He was a victim. Back at the Chronicle's office, Calder bypassed the zoning dispute story and went straight to the newspaper's digital archives. He pulled up every article from May and June of 2006 about the disappearance. He scanned the familiar details, the timeline of the trip, the discovery of the stranded students by a park ranger, the nationwide alert for the missing teacher. He then requested the original police files from Sheriff Brody, citing his role as a reporter covering a new development in a cold case. Brody, trusting him, sent over the digitized files. For hours, Calder sifted through the witness statements he and his friends had given. They all told the same story. Mr. Albright had led them on a 2-hour hike to see a unique geological formation. He'd been his usual enthusiastic self. When they returned to the drop-off point, the bus was gone. They waited, thinking he'd just moved it, but he never came back. Then, Calder found a detail he'd long forgotten, buried in the logistical planning documents for the trip. 2 chaperones were scheduled. The first was Mr. Albright. The second was another teacher from the same high school, Leland Vance, a shop teacher. According to a note in the file, Mr. Vance had called in sick the morning of the trip, a sudden, severe case of stomach flu. It was so last minute they couldn't find a replacement. Leland Vance. Calder remembered him, a quiet, intense man who smelled of sawdust and machine oil. He kept to himself, and the students found him intimidating. Calder couldn't recall ever seeing him and Mr. Albright interact much. They were from different worlds within the same school. A quick search online revealed that Leland Vance had left teaching about a year after the incident. He now owned and operated an auto repair shop in a town about 40 miles away. It was a long shot, but Vance was the only other person officially connected to that day who wasn't a student. Calder had to talk to him. The next morning, Calder drove out to Vance's auto repair. It was a grimy, cinder-block garage at the edge of a rundown town. A sign with peeling paint swung in the breeze. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of gasoline. A man in greasy overalls was bent over the engine of a pickup truck. He was older, his hair thinner, but Calder recognized him immediately. "Mr. Vance?" Calder said. Leland Vance straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes, small and hard, narrowed. "Do I know you?" "My name is Calder Hayes. I was a student at Oak Ridge High. I was on Mr. Albright's field trip, the one in 2006. Vance's face went blank, a shudder coming down. "That was a long time ago," he said, turning back to the engine. "They found something yesterday," Calder pressed on, "a seat from the bus. It was buried out at the old red granite quarry." Vance froze. He didn't turn around, but Calder saw his shoulders tense. "Is that so?" "The police are looking at the case again," Calder said, watching him carefully. "I'm a reporter now. I'm writing a story. I was hoping you could tell me about Mr. Albright. You were supposed to be on that trip with him. Vance finally turned, his expression hostile. I had the flu. Worst I've ever had. What do you want me to say? It was a tragedy. Albright was a good guy, but who knows what demons people are fighting. Now, if you don't mind, I've got work to do. His story was smooth, rehearsed, but his reaction was anything but calm. The anger in his eyes seemed out of proportion. It's just... You left teaching not long after, Calder said, pushing his luck. Did the incident have anything to do with it? I got tired of the politics, Vance snapped, and dealing with kids who think they know everything. This is better. Honest work. He picked up a heavy wrench, his knuckles white. Calder noticed they were scarred and thickened, the hands of a man used to hard physical work. All right, Calder said, backing away. Thanks for your time. As he walked back to his car, Calder couldn't shake the feeling that Vance was hiding something. His denial was too quick, his anger too raw. He wasn't just a man who had inconveniently gotten sick. He was a man who desperately wanted the past to stay buried. A few days later, Calder's phone rang again. It was Sheriff Brody. You were right, Calder, the sheriff said, his voice grim. The lab results came back on the seat. Calder held his breath. The stain was blood, a lot of it, soaked deep into the foam. The DNA is a confirmed match for Daniel Albright. A wave of cold washed over Calder. This was it. The proof. But that's not all, Brody continued. The lab found something else. Wedged in the metal frame, under the vinyl, they found a partial fingerprint. It was protected from the elements all this time. It doesn't match Albright. We're officially reclassifying this as a homicide investigation. Calder's mind immediately went to Leland Vance and his angry defensive posture. He told Sheriff Brody about his visit, about Vance's strange reaction. Vance, huh? Brody mused. His alibi was solid back then. Doctor's note and all. But maybe it's time we looked a little closer at him. While the police started their official inquiry, Calder began his own. He dove into public records, searching for anything he could find on Leland Vance. For hours, he found nothing but traffic tickets and property deeds. Then, he stumbled upon a series of court filings from late 2005 and early 2006. They were debt collection lawsuits. Leland Vance had been in serious financial trouble, owing thousands of dollars to several credit agencies and, more disturbingly, a local loan shark known for his aggressive collection methods. Vance was on the verge of losing everything. Then Calder searched Daniel Albright's financial records from the same period. He found something that made his heart pound. Just 2 months before the field trip, Mr. Albright had inherited just over $50,000 from a deceased aunt. It wasn't a fortune, but to a man like Vance, drowning in debt, it might as well have been. The pieces began to click into place, forming a dark and terrible picture. A desperate man with a crushing debt. A kind colleague with a sudden windfall of cash. It wasn't a story of a teacher having a breakdown. It was a story of blackmail, of a carefully planned crime that had been hidden for 15 years, buried under 6 feet of earth. Calder knew he had to find someone who could place Albright and Vance together outside of school, someone who could confirm they had more than just a passing professional relationship. He spent the next day calling former teachers from that era. Most remembered the two men as opposites who rarely spoke. Then he reached Mrs. Gable, the retired home economics teacher. "Oh, Leland and Daniel," she said, her voice crackling over the phone. "That's a sad story. I always thought Leland took advantage of him." Calder felt a jolt. "What do you mean?" "Daniel was too kind for his own good," Mrs. Gable explained. "Leland was always in some kind of trouble. A few weeks before that awful trip, I saw Daniel give Leland a thick envelope of cash in the parking lot after school. Leland looked like a cornered animal, and Daniel, he just looked so sad. I got the feeling it wasn't the first time. I always believed Daniel was trying to help him, but maybe he got in too deep. This was the final piece, the personal connection, the motive. It wasn't just a theory anymore." Armed with this new information, Calder called Sheriff Brody. He laid out everything. Vance's gambling debts, Albright's inheritance, and Mrs. Gable's eyewitness account of the cash exchange. "This is it, Brody," Calder said, his voice firm. "Vance faked being sick. He was on that bus. He was blackmailing Albright for the inheritance money. It's a strong motive, Brody admitted, but we need to place him at the scene. We need to match that fingerprint from the seat. Then let's go get it, Calder urged. Let's go talk to him. Together. That afternoon, Calder found himself once again driving the 40 miles to Vance's auto repair, this time with Sheriff Brody's unmarked car following close behind. When they pulled in, Leland Vance was standing outside, smoking a cigarette. When he saw Sheriff Brody get out of his car, his face paled, and he dropped the cigarette, grinding it into the gravel with his boot. Leland Vance, Brody said, his voice calm but firm. We need to ask you a few more questions about the disappearance of Daniel Albright. Vance folded his arms, trying to look defiant, but Calder could see the fear in his eyes. I told this kid everything I know. I was sick in bed that day. We know about your financial problems back in 2006, Leland, Brody said, taking a step closer. We know about the money you owed. We also know Daniel Albright gave you cash in the school parking lot a few weeks before he vanished. Vance's composure cracked. He was a friend. He was helping me out. It was a loan. We found Mr. Albright's blood on a bus seat buried in the red granite quarry, Calder cut in, his voice cold. And we found a fingerprint that isn't his. Sheriff Brody held up a small evidence kit. We'd like to get a copy of your prints, Leland, just to clear things up. It was then that Leland Vance broke. The tough, angry facade crumbled, revealing the desperate, terrified man beneath. He looked from the sheriff to Calder, his eyes wild with panic. For a moment, he seemed like he might run, but there was nowhere to go. He sank onto the dusty steps of his garage, put his head in his hands, and a sob escaped his lips. I didn't mean to kill him, he whispered, the words choked with 15 years of guilt. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. In the sterile interview room at the sheriff's station, the full story finally came out. Vance confessed everything. He had been desperate, facing threats from the loan shark. He knew Albright was a soft touch and had recently inherited money. He started by asking for loans, but his desperation grew into blackmail, threatening to reveal a minor, long-past mistake from Albright's college days that would have cost him his teaching license. The plan was for Vance to fake his illness, then secretly meet Albright during the field trip. While the boys were hiking, Vance would force Albright to drive to a bank and withdraw the rest of the inheritance. After that, Albright was supposed to drop him off at a bus station, and they would never see each other again. But in the bus, Albright fought back. He refused to be a victim anymore. He told Vance he was going to drive straight to the police. They struggled for control of the wheel. The bus swerved into the entrance of the abandoned quarry. There, inside the empty bus, the fight turned violent. Vance, bigger and stronger, grabbed a heavy tire iron from the bus's emergency kit. He just meant to scare him, he claimed, but Albright lunged for it. In the chaos, Vance struck him. Once, and Daniel Albright fell silent. Panicked, Vance knew he couldn't leave the body in the bus. He dragged Mr. Albright to a secluded spot in the quarry and buried him in a shallow grave. The bus seat was soaked in blood, a piece of evidence he couldn't leave behind. Using the tire iron, he pried it from the floor and buried it in a separate hole. He then drove the bus for 2 days straight, wiping it clean of every print before abandoning it hundreds of miles away. He returned home and, for 15 years, lived with the secret, the guilt, eating him alive, while the world remembered Daniel Albright as a coward who had run away from his life. Following the confession, Vance led the authorities back to the red granite quarry. He showed them the quiet, overgrown patch of earth where he had buried his colleague. Mr. Albright, the kind geology teacher, was finally found. Calder Hayes wrote the story of his life. The front page of the Oak Ridge Chronicle read, "Teacher murdered, not missing. 15-year mystery solved." It was a story of tragedy and betrayal, but also of vindication. It cleared the name of the man who had been unjustly condemned for 15 years. At the memorial service for Daniel Albright, the pews were filled with his former students. They were men now with families and careers of their own. Calder stood among them, no longer the abandoned boy, but the man who had brought the truth to light. As they paid their final respects, a quiet sense of closure settled over him. The ghost of May 18th was finally at peace. What do you think is a heavier burden to carry? the guilt of a terrible secret, like the one Leland Vance held for 15 years, or the unending uncertainty of not knowing what happened to a loved one, like Calder and his friends endured? If this story gave you something to think about, consider subscribing and joining our community. We explore the hidden stories and lingering questions that remind us of the complexities of human nature. We appreciate your time and your thoughtful consideration.